Let's meet my panel here in the studio this evening. Anne-Marie Trevelyan is Conservative MP for Berwick-on-Tweed. She's a firm believer in Brexit. She voted against the Prime Minister's deal in January and abstained with more than 60 Tory colleagues in that Commons vote last week, which saw Theresa May defeated again. Stephen Kinnock is a Labour MP for Aberavon. He wants a new common market-style relationship with the EU, and we'll hear more about that later on. Nikki DaCosta is Senior Counsel at Cicero, a public affairs consultancy. She's the former Director of Legislative Affairs at 10 Downing Street. And luckily for us, that means she's an expert on parliamentary procedure and legislation associated with Brexit, because she used to advise the Prime Minister on it. So we'll be tapping into that in just a moment. Nikki, you resigned your post at the end of last year. Is it a relief not to have to do Brexit every day?
I fear I've really struggled to detach myself from the process, as most people will know from my Twitter feed.
I can see that because you're here tonight. And Caroline Wheeler, Deputy Political Editor of the Sunday Times, joins us too. Welcome to you all. I'd like to start by considering the case of Shamima Begum, which has been dominating the news over the last few days. She's the schoolgirl who ran away to join ISIS in Syria. She gave birth to a baby on Saturday. Now she wants to come back to the UK, but she appears unrepentant. Caroline, how big a headache is that for the government, especially now she's had the baby?
It is a big headache, and we can see that because there's been a sort of shifting position towards her situation over even just a sort of 24-hour period. Obviously, she's had the baby boy now, and her family are very keen to have her come home, especially as she's already lost 2 other babies while she's been out in Syria. Initially, Sajid Javid, the Home Secretary, was very clear that he wanted to block her return, and said very clearly that he would stop at nothing to stop those that have gone out to fight in Syria from coming back. But his language in the Sunday Times today was slightly softer than that. And whilst he said he wouldn't hesitate to prevent Britons from coming home, he also said that it was a difficult challenge as to what to do with those who were seeking to return. And of course, we also saw Jeremy Wright this morning cast another sort of inflection on that story by basically saying that it's right that if she's able to come home, and that's the key bit of it.
Well, I thought there was a difference between those two positions, because in the Sunday Times, in your paper, Sajid Javid was saying, I have to think about the safety and security of children living in our country, as if you could somehow balance these rights. Jeremy Wright, the Culture Secretary today, and also a lawyer, seemed to be suggesting that more likely than not, it was going to be hard to stop her coming back.
Absolutely. I mean, what he actually said was it's right that if she's able to come home, she should come home, and that she should then have to face some answers about what she's been doing. And of course, earlier on in the week, David Gauke, another lawyer, said something quite similar. He also seemed to suggest that Britain might be powerless to stop her coming home, because of course this is an individual who does not have dual nationality, which makes it very difficult to stop her coming home, because in effect that would make her stateless, which is of course against international law. So it is a huge headache for the government. And we saw Lord Dannatt as well, the former head of the army, also weighed into this today, saying that we had a responsibility to those who'd gone out from Britain.
Open it up to politicians on the panel. Stephen, what would you do?
Well, I think national security has to come first, but we also have a responsibility to ensure that she doesn't become stateless. So it is a difficult situation. She's clearly showed no sign of remorse, and I think that's a very worrying indication. My view is that there needs to be a full investigation into what she's done, what is her current mindset, what has she been involved in or facilitated, and where appropriate, she should be prosecuted. But I think there's a broader question here about the number of people who've gone out to be ISIS fighters, signing up to a death cult, effectively. Mm-hmm. Should we perhaps be looking at building capacity in Iraq for putting those people on trial in Iraq? It's the Iraqi people that have suffered, and the Syrian people that have suffered. And of course, they want to set up a caliphate. They recognise no border between Syria and Iraq. Maybe we should be building capacity in Iraq to actually conduct the trials and to prosecute them there.
Anne-Marie, it's a hard one for government to get right. A lot of people in the general public might actually prefer that she doesn't return and that a signal is sent that way. How do you approach that balance?
It's been interesting talking to people actually over the weekend at home about it. I think there is that instinct of, she chose to follow this death cult message, albeit as a perhaps impressionable teenager, but nonetheless, off she went when others went to go and fight them. So the same images were having completely different impacts on young people who have gone out there to, take different sides. She is a British citizen, and the statelessness question is one that I think, if we as the United Kingdom don't take seriously, then we can't expect anyone else to. And there is a child out there born who has, British grandparents for whom that question is one which cannot be ignored. Instinctively for me, she needs to go on trial for whatever it is she may have done as part of the death cult. That's a question, but that question of the child's future, the British family's rights, and indeed her, criminality or otherwise, within our own legal system needs to be something that for me is more important than suggesting she can't come back. But I think, to understand and to take the consequences of those actions, even though she was a teenager, is something that we have to take very seriously.
And Nikki, Mr. Javid, as it happens, has not been much help by Donald Trump calling on countries to take back IS fighters. What kind of pressure does that then put on Downing Street from your experience there?
I think with all these kind of situations as they evolve, there's a tremendous pressure to respond quickly, to provide that quote, whether it's the Home Secretary and then number 10. And often you'll find that the two are trying to almost adjust their positions as you go in particular situations. It's a very complex. It's a complex case. There will be more detail than we're being exposed to right now. More will emerge, and the difficulties is when you make a statement is how do you say what do you think the public might want to hear, in addition to what they need to hear in terms of the legal problems there, and allow for some complexity for the case to evolve. So it's something that they'll be paying. It is a headache, and it's a headache to getting it right. And as you see, the lawyers get more involved and you get that advice, that also comes into it and can lead to evolving positions.
Caroline, do you sense different temperaments here in the government about this case?
Yes, I mean, I think what Nikki's just said is absolutely right. When you've got sort of the lawyers getting involved, who will be very mindful of what international law states about, when we do have a situation where somebody doesn't have a dual nationality, we do have a responsibility to them for that. I think there's also, when you are the Home Secretary and this particular issue falls upon you, and it is your duty above and beyond anything else to keep the citizens of this country safe, that will weigh very heavily on his mind. But I think when you've got the pressure building, where you've got Trump basically saying, unless you take these people on board and do something with them, then we'll be forced to release them. And we don't have consular access to this particular individual. It is going to make it very hard.
Well, now it's hard to introduce the subject of Brexit tonight without first saying that there are just over 5 weeks to go until we leave the EU and 10 days until Theresa May's next high noon moment in the Commons, when she must report back to MPs on progress in negotiating changes to a withdrawal deal to address the problem of the Irish backstop. Business leaders are becoming increasingly vocal with their concerns about the consequences of leaving without a deal. The Senior Vice President of Airbus, Catherine Bennett, told Andrew Marr this morning that this outcome could be catastrophic.
It's time for the politicians to come together and help us not have this uncertainty. And we as business people feel we need to speak up and ensure the facts are out there on the table.
Well, whether the politicians gathered round our table can reach any consensus, we'll find out in a moment. But Caroline, talk us through what is happening on the negotiations this week.
So it's going to be quite a busy week all round, even though it is half term. And of course, MPs are sitting this week. But we've got Stephen Barclay, the Brexit Secretary, and Geoffrey Cox in Brussels tomorrow, followed by further meetings throughout the week with the Prime Minister due to meet Jean-Claude Juncker either Wednesday or Thursday, I believe. And then again, she's actually going to Sharm el-Sheikh towards the end of the week, where she'll see all the European leaders. So it'll be a busy week on the diplomatic front. But I think what's going to be quite a pivotal moment is that we've got Geoffrey Cox apparently giving a speech on Tuesday where there's going to be some kind of
to the Attorney General.
That's correct. Some kind of hint as to what they're going to be able to do in terms of the backstop in order to appease some of those on the Brexit benches who are less than happy with the idea that the backstop remains.
We got a bit of a hint today, perhaps, from Jeremy Wright, Culture Secretary, saying it's not the mechanism, it's the objective. There was an attempt, I thought, to knead the English language into some sort of more pliable shape on the backstop. How's that faring?
Well, that to me sounds as if, again, what we're seeing is a suggestion that they can't actually reopen the withdrawal agreement, and they're trying to sort of do some sort of keyhole surgery on the withdrawal agreement to insert words in which might be slightly more palatable towards the Brexiteers. However, this has been the issue that's been raised on a number of occasions where the Prime Minister has rowed back from what was promised in the Brady Amendment, which was alternative to the backstop. But as one prominent Brexiteer said to me, it's not keyhole surgery you need, it's open heart surgery.
Gosh, so many images there, Caroline. Now, Anne-Marie, the Prime Minister wrote to all Tory MPs today, appealing to them to sacrifice their personal preferences in the national interest. Strong language there. She wanted compromises. She said, warning, history will judge us all by the parts we've played in this process. Were you moved?
It was interesting to receive a dear colleague from the Prime Minister. It's not something you get very often. You get technical ones mostly, setting out the reasons for a policy change. So this was a big sort of Churchillian statement rather than the average one. I think, the Brexiteers in the Conservative Party, our WhatsApp groups chatter away, felt that it was a good attempt to try and draw together all the voices. But we feel that the national interest is to deliver the referendum, having been the party that set it running and asked the British people to take a decision and saying we would abide by it. I think we have a very strong, straightforward view that is what we must do. We must achieve what we asked them and they told us to do.
And it's the we there is the ERG. It's interesting that you that's what you're identifying with.
Well, we as Parliament.
We as Parliament.
Is, I think, how those of us who are Brexiteers who perhaps naturally feel an affinity for the result that came through, but genuinely feel that if we're to hold our heads high and to believe that democracy has a value and not both destroy the credibility of the Conservative Party but of Parliament more generally going forwards, we must deliver what it is they asked us to do.
But what would she need to bring back from the negotiations in order for you to come on board and support her? The ERG is under pressure now to soften some of its resistance. Are you thinking about your personal bottom line?
So it isn't only those who are Brexiteers who have found the withdrawal agreement unpalatable. There are many on the Remain side who are much more violently opposed to it in a number of ways, including the Irish backstop part. I think for those of us who feel that we've already, stepped a long way from a clean, genuinely, full Brexit, if you like, the reality is that the Irish backstop part risks us finding ourselves trapped permanently in that customs union framework, which is unacceptable to those who feel we need to deliver a real Brexit, because it doesn't do that. We will be tied in with EU decision making without any controls over them. And for those who want to see that isn't it. So that's got to change.
OK, but what about Jeremy Wright today? It's not the mechanism, it's the objective. How realistic is it to make that distinction?
So it's the outcome. It has to be, the other side, it has to be that we will be in control of those things. So if we have to stay in a backstop for a little while, that we can control coming out of it, that we can determine. So it's outcomes, as ever. It's not what it looks like. It's the outcome. What the other side of whatever this withdrawal agreement looks like will the ability for the United Kingdom to control its destiny be. And if it isn't genuinely under our control, then I don't think Brexiteers will support it.
And if it was in a letter, a protocol, some other form, then in the substance of the agreement...
I think there's those who've been, I've only been in Parliament for 4 years, up close and personal with legislation and all the detail. But those who've been in Parliament a long time, who watched the Maastricht Treaty go through and on other legislation, a treaty is at the top. A codicil is below it. A nice letter is below that. At the end of the day, in a court of law, the treaty is always the one that's going to win. So that's where the open heart surgery, as Caroline puts it, will need to be done.
Stephen Kinnock, a lot of your colleagues think Jeremy Corbyn is, to an extent, colluding, as they might put it, in a Tory Brexit. How do you read the Labour leader's actions at the moment?
I think that we've got a clear and distinct position on this, which is to change the political declaration to make a clear and unequivocal commitment to a form of customs union or customs arrangement and full single market alignment. So I think what we're seeing is very clear red water opening up between the two parties, because our interpretation of the mandate, our interpretation of 5248, is that it's a mandate to move house but stay in the same neighbourhood. It's not a mandate to jump off the cliff and crash the British economy, destroy the jobs and the livelihoods of the people that we were elected to represent. That would truly be a betrayal of our role in Parliament and as MPs.
I notice people use we quite loosely in these conversations. Do you think that we, as in the Labour leadership, feels as you feel about that? I mean, what about that charge that one way or the other, Jeremy Corbyn is spinning this out towards a point where there could be a Brexit?
Well, we have to go on what is the written word. You know, I think the letter that Jeremy sent to Theresa May was definitely a step in the right direction. I mean, he's in essence now saying that we need the single market alignment that will protect workers' rights, protect environmental rights, consumer rights, and we want to get a customs union in place, which will also deliver frictionless trade across the Irish borders. We protect the union, we protect the Good Friday Agreement, and I think we're looking to find a way here out of a constitutional and political crisis, and that means compromising. It means British politics has to rediscover the lost art of compromise. And I'm afraid that there is a minority of a minority that is running the show. And that's not democratic and it's not right. I can only imagine that a lot of the loyalists in the Conservative Parliamentary Party received that letter from Theresa May today and said, you know, I've been voting for your deal for the sort of 17th time. Why are you sending me a letter? I'm not the problem. If I were them, I would be unbelievably frustrated. I mean, if they want to vote for Theresa May's deal, that's up for them. I think Theresa May's deal is an awful deal because the political declaration is so vague and woolly. It's £39 billion of taxpayers' money for a leap of faith. So I won't vote for it, but there are lots of Conservative MPs who do, but they're being constantly frustrated by the hardline Brexiteers in their party.
Yes, it must be said that you've had a bit of rebranding a bit around your ideas. I mean, we talked about Norway options. There was Norway Plus, now something called Common Market 2.0. I mean, really, what is the chance of something that you're proposing around that kind of customs union-based solution actually getting anywhere, given the very short timeline we have?
The rebranding is driven by the fact that there's so many people on the doorstep who say to me, look, I voted to join the common market back in the 1970s, and then somewhere along the line, the EU became something I hadn't voted for. And when I say, well, I think there is a way of going back to that strong economic, commercial relationship, but without all the political paraphernalia of ever closer union and the institutions and that sort of project, if you like, the European project, people say, well, yeah, that sounds like a good compromise to me.
Well, you basically found no one understood the Norway.
Well, it's also because we're not Norway. If and when we go into the European Economic Area through EFTA and we have this arrangement, we will clearly be going in with far more weight, with all due respect to our Norwegian cousins, than they have. And it would change. I think it also creates an exciting opportunity for the European Union to finally have a number of countries with associate status. I think a lot of the Nordics, some of the other Northern European countries, Central and Eastern Europeans, would actually want to be part of a club which says, right, we're not in the euro, we're not in that deeper political integration, but we want to be in the single market and have frictionless trade.
Nikki, you're a close observer of Parliament and also the Prime Minister. Is she interested in any of this, or does she just want to get her own deal through at any cost and actually take any risk to do so?
It's very difficult. I mean, everyone here will know that, you know, I left in mid-November and 2 months, at least 2 months have gone by. So it's very difficult to judge right now. What I would say is that the Prime Minister is somebody of tremendous integrity and commitment. And I genuinely think that she is working for the national interest. And I think that she will, you know, she does not spare herself in any way. Every hour there is that she will give to this, every part of her.
But you haven't said whether you think she's got any flexibility or not. She could be all of that and stubborn as a mule.
No, so I think that the difficulty is, and what we've had throughout, is this balancing of the two sides of the party, the balancing of maintaining a majority. And that means that there have had to be, for both sides, compromises throughout. And, you know, if you might say for children, they're both as bad as each other. And, you know, the Prime Minister has to be sort of the person that sort of sits there and kind of weaves her way between it. So I would say that she probably, more than anyone, has probably tried to be flexible, but the difficulty is that nobody quite likes it.
Anne-Marie, the charge levelled often against the ERG, the hardline Brexiteers, is making Theresa May's job impossible. I mean, she has so little room for manoeuvre, and with the vote last week and the mood does not seem to be at all, as Stephen Kinnock mentioned, the need for compromise. Do you see any requirement to compromise on your position?
I think the party backbenchers and quietly ministers alike have all come together in the last few weeks through what it's been described as the Malthouse Compromise, because it started coming together in Kit Malthouse's office. Is that how history is made? the office was in the right place and close to a cup of tea. Those come together, so both Brexiteers and Remainers, to actually look at how...
So that's very briefly the Malthouse Compromise.
So the Malthouse coming together to say, well, how could we between us reach something that, for us as Brexiteers, the Ireland part of the withdrawal agreement just isn't acceptable as it stands. This is what we need to see changes in. What bothers the Remainers, the risk of not having an implementation period, having a bit of a longer period, and actually working together to bring something together and take it to the Prime Minister, and it's now with officials in the Cabinet Office to actually try and get to grips with how that could work. I think the frustration has been that this is something that, many colleagues have been trying to get Number 10 to listen to for many months, but it's great that it's happening now at least. And I think the challenge is to make sure that Number 10 and those officials going across to Brussels are actually sharing what is genuinely a policy framework which would get the support of the whole Conservative Party, which is what the Prime Minister is trying to achieve.
Really brief point, but didn't Steve Baker, leading ERG, just say this was all a waste of time going back, allegedly in a story today in the WhatsApp group? There's a waste of time. So you don't think it's a waste of time for Theresa May to keep her shuttle diplomacy going?
No, absolutely not. The whole point of, I used to buy and sell companies for a living. Negotiations are always completed at the last minute. The challenge is that this is being done in public, which is so very difficult for the Prime Minister.
Stephen Kinnock.
The problem with the Malthouse Compromise is that it's a conversation within the Conservative Party. The European Union has made it absolutely crystal clear that the withdrawal agreement is not going to be reopened. And whichever variation of the Malthouse Compromise you want, it involves reopening the withdrawal agreement. And Conservative colleagues do talk about negotiations going down to the last minute. The last minute happened in December. It's done. It's finished. The only piece of the deal that is open is the political declaration, and the EU has said many, many times they're open to that being renegotiated, political declaration on the future relationship, but the withdrawal agreement is closed.
Nikki, while all this is going on, the government is trying to get through legislation it needs to deal with the possibility of a no-deal Brexit. How's that going?
So the key thing for here is think about two buckets. There's a sort of deal bucket, which is that in those circumstances, you probably just need the vote and then the withdrawal agreement bill. And then you've got a bucket for no deal, into which you place about 6 bills. That's immigration, agriculture, fish, one on healthcare, reciprocal arrangements. I'm going to make it...
It's quite a bucket anyway.
Healthcare, etc.
And how is the bucket going?
Well, I think the difficulty... Look, Number 10 have said that all are required for exit day. I think the thing that everyone needs, there's always a degree of tolerance on the dates that royal assent are needed for. To work out that tolerance, you think about when is legal certainty needed, when do you need to use the powers in the bill, what are the policy requirements, and that's going to give you a range of possibilities which give the government some flexibility. And into that, you also then probably as from the outside, things you can look at are when was the bill introduced, and that probably gives you a sense of how important it is to get it through. So of those bills, actually I didn't mention, which I should have led with, the trade bill is probably the most important one. You've then got a load of SIs. They are actually making decent progress right now. I think there's about 450 of the less than 600 that are required. A lot of SIs going through next week. So it's in a reasonable space. The difficulty is you can't move those bills forward when they're being held to ransom. And what we saw in the finance bill is that legislation that's meant to prepare you for no deal is being sort of neutered by those that don't want no deal, and therefore leading you to not be legislatively prepared. So even if you tried to move the bills forward, you'd be stuck.
Anne-Marie, does that cause you any anxiety, the thought of all this being not concluded and the prospect of no deal, the idea being that some Eurosceptics divide into those who actually wouldn't mind no deal at all, and those who think if we hold our position, we will get what we want?
I think there is generally only one Brexiteer that I'm aware of who actually wants no deal. I think the rest of us absolutely would rather have a withdrawal agreement, bucket, if you like. I could describe it as a basket. But,
bargain bucket.
Mine's a basket, I think, of, collecting my vegetables from my garden. Because it's all in it together. So it's much easier and the implementation period's there. So it's a smooth flow. But if for some reason that isn't the case, the key is to have all the, the critical bits of legislation in place so that nothing, legally falls off a cliff. We're seeing all the preparedness in practical terms, in terms of, flights and medicines and all those activities. Calais saying there won't be problems. The practicalities coming together so that everyone, is going to work in a coherent way together, because nobody wants to see, both on our side of the water or indeed on the other, any kind of blockages. So those things all seem to be coming together. I think one of the frustrations I've had over the last sort of 6 to 9 months is that, businesses particularly who've been shouting, saying we don't know what to do. And the government has been very slow to share what has been a huge amount of work going on behind the scenes. And now, suddenly, since January, it's all coming out, which is great. But I think there's been a lot of frustration, which hopefully will now ease.
Last thoughts, Stephen.
We're woefully underprepared for a no-deal Brexit. Everyone can see that. The EU can see that as well. It's why one of the reasons our negotiating position's been so weak, and it's unbelievably incompetent the way the whole thing's been handled. Andrea Leadsom and Hunt have said that there is going to have to be an extension just because of the sheer weight of legislation that goes through. I think the key piece of legislation is the Withdrawal Agreement Implementation Bill. It's one of the politically, legally and constitutionally one of the most important bills we'll ever have had to look at in Parliament, because it will give force to the withdrawal agreement, including things like the transition period, which, by the way, says we will be under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice for the entire transition. But do we really think that colleagues like Bill Cash and other Brexiteers are going to just allow that to sail through without amendments? That bill will be like a Christmas tree with bauble after bauble of amendment hanging off it from the Brexiteers. So the idea that they're going to get it through in 5 minutes is for the birds.
You need a majority.
That's an unseasonal reference to Christmas trees. So I'm calling that one out of order on grounds that it is, in fact, February. So let's have a look at what's sure to be a big talking point tomorrow, the publication of a long-awaited Select Committee report into fake news and the use of our personal data by political campaigns. Even more pressure on the big tech companies since that got underway on a number of fronts. Caroline, what's this report all about?
So this is the Damien Collins, who's been doing a lot of work on this, who's the chairman of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, who's been looking at this for over a year now. And basically we get a clue as to where he's going in this because he wrote and did an article for The Telegraph this morning where he talks about the irresponsible nature of social media and the fact that there is nothing really that we can do at the moment to sort of bring them to book and to make sure that they're not putting misleading content on their websites, which people then pick up as being fact. Now, what's also interesting about this report is that actually as part of this, his interim report, which was out over the summer, one of the things that he was really keen to look at was about the threat to democracy that this fake news was having. And he really wants to see much more of an investigation done into that and to whether or not there were any interferences into any of our electoral events over the last couple of years. And of course, that comes from what's happened in America and the Mueller inquiry. So it's very, very topical. But the main focus of this report, we think, is all going to be about having an independent regulator underpinned by some kind of code of ethics, which is really going to have teeth to say to these social media companies, actually, you can't get away with this. And if you do try and do this, you will face fines, you will face penalties.
Stephen, you've also been doing some work on reforming electoral law and transparency in political campaigning. You've got an all-party parliamentary group seeking to clarify party funding. In the light of that, it's a tall order. How far have you got?
We haven't quite established it yet, but we're in the process. What we want to do is launch an inquiry into transparency in campaign finance and also transparency in the illicit use and harvesting of personal data. And I think we've got a Wild West out there at the moment. It's a really worrying situation. You've got the National Crime Agency looking into Aaron Banks and the source of his funding, £9 million given to Leave.eu and UKIP, the biggest political donation in history, and we don't know the source of it. You've got Cambridge Analytica in there. You've got Leave.eu and Vote Leave both being fined by the Electoral Commission. But frankly, the fines that they've received are, the cost of doing business. So we've got a toothless watchdog. And we've got an explosion of the use of technology, armies of Russian bots being used to affect the debate on Twitter. So there's a huge amount that needs to be done. I think we need primary legislation, which completely. We've got legislation and we've got a regulator, but it's an analog situation for the digital age. We've got to have laws in place, policies in place, because I think faith in our democracy is crumbling. And this is far bigger than Brexit. This is this goes way beyond, the details of that. This is about trust and faith in our democracy going forward.
Anne-Marie, are you sympathetic to that line of argument?
Yes, I think the great challenge of social media is that, when it was all starting out, we are but a platform, said Facebook, said Twitter, it's all for you. So it's the challenge of tackling the human's ability to tell what they believe to be a truth, or indeed not, if they might be a rotten bot or anything else. That is the challenge, is how we as humans choose to behave in our society. We're using this framework. So we can punish the platform owner. We can ask them to police it and make it a much more, closed and, normal media environment where truth is evidenced. But that's very, very difficult. And fundamentally, if we believe that there is value to social media, we're not going to shut them down and decide the internet in this sense is a bad thing. We have to start to understand how humans behave and think of ways to actually manage that.
Hang on. That's all quite nice and broad ranging. But do you believe, in the case of the referendum campaign, that there was foreign interference?
Well, I have no way to assess that information. I'm not inside the security services. There is interference in any global networks. There are pressures coming from all directions, most of which the average punter reading their Facebook when they get home from work and have had a glass of wine isn't going to be able to assess in any way what its source is from. So the question of gullibility and management of that information is a very difficult one, and I think we should challenge it. I'm a great believer in transparency being a good way to educate. So we need to do more of it. But it's, I don't see how in a global sense the UK necessarily will be able to solve it single-handedly. I think we've all got to work together on it.
Well, that's the point, isn't it, Nikki? How much appetite is there realistically to legislate in this area when Damon Collins and his committee have let off a lot of steam about this and probably will again this week? But do you see anything changing?
First of all, there's a bit of a question. I'm assuming that this would tie into the already announced online harms bill, which the government has been a proponent of. There's the white paper. The difficulty here is, and I think the Guardian used the phrase this morning, of sweeping new legislation. 3 words to strike fear into anyone responsible for the safe passage of legislation, signifying as it does broad scope and huge potential for amendment. So essentially, anything the government chooses to leave out from the DCMS Select Committee report may well potentially be added back in by MPs. So
apart from a scepticism over sweeping legislation, it's a bit of a Downing Street old-timer. What are the pitfalls?
I think here it's about really making sure, you can have virtue signalling legislation. You don't do it in a time of minority government. What you do in a time of minority government is really think through, does this legislation work? And I think here, in terms of having a former Attorney General as the DCMS Secretary, he's going to really want to be interrogating that and going, does this do the job? What are the consequences we haven't thought about? Because we're not going to get another legislative slot to undo this if we get it wrong. And so therefore, yes, I think you'll probably have to wait to the next session. It's going to take its time. It may well have to be a carryover bill as well because of the size of it. But these are the kind of things you'd be thinking about.
You're bursting coming
very briefly. It's also just these platforms, Facebook, they are making billions in profit. They should be investing in more people in their teams to actually be doing the fact-checking and to rebuild trust.
Just invested in hiring Nick Clegg, the former Deputy Prime Minister.
I'm sure they've still got some change left from that.
Now, is it time for an epoch-making political realignment? For months now, commentators have been grimly or gleefully predicting that the Conservative Party would split over Brexit, or Labour would be torn apart by ideological differences between Jeremy Corbyn's enthusiasts and his critics, or even both. Well, the two major parties are still holding together, but with more fractures and schisms by the month. For how much longer? Our reporter John Beasley has been asking whether there's anything we can learn about the present from the splits of the past.
Theresa May is not beyond appealing to the judgment of history when commending her Brexit deal to the Commons.
No, it is not perfect, and yes, it is a compromise. But when the history books are written, people will look at the decision of this House tomorrow and ask, did we deliver on the country's vote to leave the European Union?
But there is another question which future historians might need to ask. Which should the Prime Minister have considered more important, her deal or the future of her fractious party?
We cannot get ourselves into a position where we're associated with rejecting the UK leaving the EU without a withdrawal agreement. It's a catastrophic and foolish negotiating error.
Most of us in the Conservative Party, we are sufficiently united to want to try to operate a coherent government. But the truth is we're finding it harder and harder to do. It starts to bring into question whether, in fact, the government is able to operate in the national interest at all.
Dominic Grieve and before him Steve Baker, two senior Conservative backbenchers, illustrating the gulf of opinion which might soon force Theresa May to choose between what she considers best for her country and best for her party. Tim Bale is Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University, London.
If she is to get a deal through Parliament, she is going to have to decide whether she is going to lose the support of some of her ultra-Brexiteers in the ERG in order for the legislation required to pass. That means that she is facing the possibility that the Conservative Party, or at least some Conservative MPs, could temporarily or even permanently leave the Conservative Party, or at least lose the Conservative Party whip.
Professor Bale recently suggested that Theresa May might benefit from reviewing how history had judged past prime ministers who'd faced a great national question with a divided party. Her predecessor, Sir Robert Peel, is one example. In the 1840s, the Tories split when he decided to repeal the Corn Laws.
It was a U-turn. He had previously always said that he wanted to keep the Corn Laws. The Corn Laws basically was this legislation which gave the landed interests, the agricultural and aristocratic elements within Britain, protection from foreign corn, which would have reduced the corn in Britain. And Peel had always stood by that.
Professor Jane Ridley of Buckingham University is a biographer and historian with a specialist interest in the politics of the Victorian era. She says that Peel's change of heart was a response to industrial poverty, a disastrous series of harvests, and a terrible famine in Ireland.
Peel felt that if you got rid of the Corn Laws, this would reduce the price of bread, and therefore real wages would increase, and this would relieve distress. But there was something else too, which was the Irish famine. Peel argued that by repealing the Corn Laws, it would redress the famine. But I think that for Peel, it's more profound than that. He was a very religious man. And I think that for him, it was a sort of act of atonement somehow.
The ensuing split between Peel's free traders and the protectionist landowners helped ensure that it would be almost 30 years before the Conservatives won another general election. Peel himself died in 1850 with no regrets for the choices he'd made.
It may be that I shall leave a name sometimes remembered, with expressions of goodwill in the abodes of those whose lot it is to labour and to earn their daily bread by the sweat of their brow, when they shall recruit their exhausted strength with abundant and untaxed food, the sweeter because it is no longer leavened by a sense of injustice.
Step forward more than 80 years to the Great Depression. With Britain on its uppers, another Prime Minister, Labour's Ramsay MacDonald, split with his party, this time over his policy of austerity.
No party government, however well led and however nationalistically inclined, can solve those problems. I appeal to you to give us, during this transition time, a government that will be a union of all parties.
I was brought up to believe it was a great betrayal. I was brought up by my mother to think of Ramsay MacDonald as the great Satan, with Philip Snowden and one or two others who supported Ramsay being wicked, not bad, mistaken, misguided, but wicked. I was brought up to hate him. But I think it was much more complicated than we now make it out to be.
Lord Hattersley, a former deputy Labour leader, reflecting on Ramsay MacDonald's fateful decision to break with the party that he helped create and lead a national government dominated by Conservatives. Roy Hattersley told me that Ramsay MacDonald made the wrong decision, but he can understand why.
Labour Party were totally unprepared for the situation. The cabinet was split, I think, 4 different ways. There were those who wanted to take the economic austerity measures. There were those who wanted to resign and leave it to the Tories. There were those who didn't want to do anything. There were those who didn't know what to do. And what's more, they didn't understand the economic tools at their disposal. 6 weeks after the new government had been formed, the national government, with Ramsay as the Prime Minister, they took some of the remedial action, including devaluing the pound. And Graham, who had been, I think, Secretary of Scotland in the Labour government, said, nobody told us we could do that. Now, if you have a cabinet, nobody tells them what they can do to solve the economic situation. It's not surprising if the Prime Minister goes off the rails.
And we may be hearing a lot more about these splits from the past as both major parties battle with the tensions of the present. As we've already heard, Europe is the great dividing line among Conservatives. For Labour, it's more complex.
We're being pushed to the edge on Brexit, on Venezuela, on anti-Semitism, and it's for Jeremy Corbyn. He needs to show that the Labour Party is a broad church. He's pushing us to the edge.
The Labour MP Angela Smith venting her frustrations this week on the BBC's Look North. So should we fear a split in either of the larger parties? Is a realignment inevitable?
Well, what we now know, or perhaps we've always known, is that Britain isn't a two-party system, it's a three- or four-party system. And the Labour Party is basically two parties, and has been for all my lifetime in it. The Tory Party equally. And the two parties hang together when it's convenient for them to hang together, but fall apart when it's convenient to fall apart. And the Labour Party today, so it's patently two parties, that people naturally say the split may come. I hope it won't, but it's a possibility.
And while Lord Hattersley hopes that Labour can hang together, the historian Jane Ridley believes that party splits often permit a new vigour to enter political life.
Well, if you look at the historical record, I think that in many ways party splits are creative. I mean, they're the way you get change. I mean, the split of the Liberal Party after the First World War into the supporters of Asquith and the supporters of Lloyd George, it lets in the Labour Party and it leads to a massive realignment of British politics. The way British politics realigns is through party splits, I would say.
For Professor Tim Bale, the key question is whether the existing parties are fully aligned with the voters that they claim to represent.
If we now have a party system peopled by parties that don't reflect collective preferences, then it probably is a good thing that the party system is shaken up and we lose some parts, or indeed the whole of some parties, and we move towards a system which contains either radically changed parties or, in fact, completely new parties. The point is that the party system really does need to reflect the electorate, and at the moment, one could argue, it doesn't quite do that.
Professor Tim Bale ending that report there by John Beasley. There's a lot of talk of how Brexit is straining both main parties to breaking point. Speculation about a number of Labour MPs imminently splitting away. Indeed, talk tonight that Chukwuemeka may be about to do that. Stephen Kinnock, do you sense something is about to happen?
The talk has been going on for so long that I say with great regret that yes, I think probably there will be some kind of splintering. It just seems to have been in the rumour mill for so long that it's unlikely that it wouldn't be the outcome. I think in terms of...
Do you find it tempting?
No. Look, the Labour Party is the greatest force for good in the history of British politics, and we have a duty to deliver for the people that we are elected to represent and to change the country for the good. And the Labour Party is the vehicle to do that. I am a very fervent supporter of proportional representation. I've campaigned for many years for a radical reform of our electoral system. If we want to have a realignment and a change of political culture, we have to change the electoral system.
So what would your message then be to those like Chukwuemeka, Chris Leslie, moderates, pro-Europeans, got a lot in common with you that way? What would you be saying to them?
I would say to them that there are certain people in the party with whom they disagree very strongly. The way to win the battle, if you like, is to stay in and fight. And I believe in politics. The role of politics is to be in there, having the debate, having the argument and winning that argument and persuading rather than trying to, shout from the outside, let's get in and let's change things from the inside.
The loyalty pledge that's going the rounds on social media today, some people seem to think it's a reasonable demand to swear loyalty to the Labour Party under this present leadership. Something it's a bit Animal Farm. Where do you come down? Have you signed?
For me, there's the only unconditional love I've ever had is for my children. And I don't have unconditional love for anybody else. And, I will always support the leadership of my party, but not unconditionally. And when the leader of
so you're not signing, in other words?
I'm not signing something which is a blind and unconditional loyalty pledge. I mean, Jeremy's been on a journey on Russia. He finally came to accept that the Russians were behind the Skripal attack. He's saying the right things on NATO. He's been on a journey on the European Union. I hope that our side of the party and our argument is beginning to help to take our leader on that journey.
Quickly bring in Anne-Marie. Some of your colleagues think Brexiteers like yourself are a bit of a party within a party, your own whipping system, your own WhatsApp groups and all the rest. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think, we have always been the broad church and the Conservative Party, and whilst the European question does bring out some, very different views and very interesting talking to colleagues, I talk to everybody about why, they feel the EU project is one they would rather have their country in and I wouldn't, is only one very small part of what the Conservative Party is about. I would disagree with Stephen that the Labour Party is the only reforming and powerful party over the centuries to actually help this country to grow. The economics and the reductions in poverty have been done in very many cases through conservative philosophies. And I think that continues to drive what fundamentally makes a right-wing, if you like, person, someone who believes in rights and responsibilities.
That's all very well, but people are some people in your ranks, like not only a few, have questioned the loyalty of the ERG, the hardline Brexiteers in the party, to the Prime Minister at this incredibly difficult time over Brexit.
Well, people are entitled to their opinion. I think that's quite the opposite. I think because this is such a difficultly unique situation politically, because we are working on the back of a referendum, that very strange, rather blunt tool which we chose to use, if we believe in our electorate, we have to actually follow that through.
Nikki, do you sense a change coming?
Certainly not in the Conservative Party. I think it is a broad church and people tend to, I've noticed that the utterances in the Conservative Party tend to be, you should leave, not I'm leaving.
Labour, you're not so sure.
I don't think anyone should leave.
Well, the front pages of the papers have come in. Caroline Wheeler has quickly whizzed through them. What have you got for us?
So there seems to be two main thrusts of the story tomorrow's papers. The main one is again back to Shamima Begum, and this is the interview which she did today where she's just given birth to her baby boy who's lying beside her as she's speaking to this interviewer, and she's saying to them, people should feel sympathy for me. I feel a lot of people should have sympathy for me. I didn't know what I was getting into when I left. I was just hoping maybe for the sake of my child that they might let me come back.
How do you think that sympathy call is going to come down? Clearly she's decided, or it's been decided, that that's the way she should pitch her case.
It seems like it's a sort of orchestrated pitch for this, particularly after she's just had this obviously very powerful, she's given birth to this child, she's lost two other children. We're having a few more details about the death of those two other children, one at age 18 months, one at 9 months, which is, going to add a lot of weight to her case that she's just had this other child. But it's interesting, the treatment of the story in some of the papers. Some have done it very straight, show me some sympathy, have talked about her case, but in others she also says in the interview that she kind of has no regrets and that she had a good time and that she knew what she was getting into. So there's a kind of split really here between people and treatment of the story, as in, this is something that we should buy into, and potentially actually is this something which is just a bit more, needs a bit of a kind of colder and harder look at.
And that's very difficult, isn't it? If you've got someone and she is young, she's clearly been impressionable, but if she doesn't express any remorse or repentance, and really more difficult perhaps to gain public acceptance for her coming back.
Without a doubt, but I think the question is, understanding, and it's a very difficult one both for the diplomatic services and then the security services to assess the situation and reach a considered decision, considering also that child's future needs to be considered.
Facebook and digital gangsters, very strong words there in that report upcoming tomorrow.
Yes.
Facebook and the like, but particularly Facebook.
The Guardian is the one paper that splashed on this story today, which is right and apt because they've done a lot of the reporting around this particular, but they are also focusing on Mark Zuckerberg, and basically part of the report that they're referring to is that he's going to get a really hard time on this tomorrow, particularly in that he's failed to turn up to Parliament and ask questions on 3 separate occasions. Of course, Jeremy Wright's going out to see him, or maybe
we
not.
Think he's going to see
this week.
Some of us think he's going to end up seeing Nick Clegg. Stephen Kinnock, how tough would you be here? And you're obviously interested on the impact, and as you think, sometimes harmful impact of technology on the democratic process.
Yeah.
How would you pursue this? How would you go about it?
It's an absolute disgrace that Zuckerberg hasn't come in to see the Select Committee, and it does actually pose questions about how we can give the Select Committee more power in terms of bringing people to
easily get an America's head of a company based in America to come and talk to Parliament.
No, but I think this is about our politics and our constitution, and Mr. Zuckerberg runs a company which is having a profoundly undermining effect on trust in our democracy. So I think, that's bigger than just his profit and loss figures. I think the critical point is to shift them from being a platform to being a publisher. They have to behave as publishers. That's the change we need to see.
Well, thanks all. That's all we have time for tonight. And thank you to Caroline Wheeler, to Anne-Marie Trevelyan, Stephen Kinnock and Nikki DaCosta. The Westminster Hour will be back same time next week. But for now, from me and everyone here, a very good night.